Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. Pleased to have as my guest on this edition Andrew Broy, who is the president of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, INCS. And as you can see, we're talking education reform, so we may need this. I also thought, Andrew, that you would feel more comfortable speaking to the bottle because it would be like talking to an Illinois legislator.
I can do that.
On the topic.
Very easily.
All right, we'll take this away. But thank you for joining us, number one. I want to get your reaction to this statement. The charter school reform movement in Illinois has been successful substantively in terms of charter school performance overall, but is flailing politically. And of course, the latter informs the ability of the former to continue. Is that a fair statement?
I think there's truth in both portions of that. So on the policy side, we've seen dramatic growth in charters and great success. In fact, there'll be a report out this fall that shows college going rates and college completion rates among charter schools are fantastic in terms of outperforming comparison peer schools. But there's no doubt we're in a real political challenge right now, driven by funding challenges, demographic shifts, the fight between Madigan and Rauner at the state capitol, and then CPS's fight with the CTU. We're kind of caught as a political football between those two parties.
And so here's the thing that's confusing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but charter schools in Chicago represent about 25% of the students?
25% high school students, about 15% elementary students.
Okay, so what is like 60,000 overall?
Yep, 60,000 students.
And yet they represent 50% of the kids that go on to college.
That's roughly right. It's a little less than that, about 45%.
Okay. So if it's working so well, why would anyone want to stop it or cap it, as both the mayor and the Chicago Teachers Union agreed to do in their last contract?
Yeah, the short answer is politics. Right? We compete for access to buildings and resources. So every time a student attends a charter school, the money follows the student to that school. That creates some hurt feelings among the schools that are losing students, and because of that, there's been this political challenge. I think from the mayor's perspective, he wanted to avoid a looming strike, and one way to do that in a non-monetary concession way was to limit charter growth, and that's what happened in the CTU contract, unfortunately.
So the most important thing in Chicago is to make sure nobody's feelings get hurt. I mean, in terms of K through 12, the goal is to make sure not that children are educated, but that nobody's feelings are hurt.
It's part of it. And I would say if you look at the constituencies that demand charter schools across the city, on the west side and the south side, the enrollment lists, we've got the wait lists. We have thousands of parents still on wait lists for charter schools. They want access to better schools.
What's that? So there's roughly 60,000 in. What's the wait list for charter schools?
15,000.
Another 15,000.
Roughly, and we've got more demand than we can actually serve. But keep in mind, CPS is also losing enrollment apace. They lost about 10,000 students year over year, which is the largest number going back 12 or 13 years. And that is putting real pressure on existing schools that are downsizing to compete. I think that's positive. I think it's good to give parents options and choices. There's some folks that think we shouldn't do that. And that's what the ideological fight is about.
Well, you know, the thing that's weird about this issue is that there seems to be a lot of ideological consensus on charter schools as a positive innovation. I mean, you have Governor Rauner, who funded a charter school in Chicago. You have Pritzker, who running for governor on the Democrat side, who funded a charter school and his family in Chicago. And I've heard a lot of support from people that are both self-identified Republicans, self-identified Democrats for charter schools. It usually tops the majority threshold in terms of popular support. Mm-hmm. So how can politicians get away with opposing majority will and, generally speaking, bipartisan consensus?
Because politicians oppose majority will all the time on things, right? If you look 20 years ago when the charter school movement started in this state, so we had our first charter school open up in 1997. We're 20 years in. But in 97, there was a very strong bipartisan support for the charter model at the federal level. Bill Clinton, in fact, passed the first charter school program in D.C. to wide bipartisan majorities. Even as recently as Obama and Arne Duncan being in D.C., we had huge coalitions on both sides of the aisle supporting charter schools. In the past 2 years, though, there's been a pretty seismic shift in this bipartisan coalition, and a lot of our Democratic allies out there are feeling pressured in certain ways because of the optics of the charter movement now.
By the teachers union.
By the union mainly, but by allied groups that are saying charters aren't for everybody, they don't serve all students, they're trying to select students in. A lot of these things simply aren't true, but they're trying to win the public media campaign about charters and misinform the public to build this opposition.
It's always one of the things that's fascinating to me is people who are unwilling to defend the performance of the system they're defending, but compare a reform innovation not to the system they won't defend, but to utopia, right? The idea that in charter schools, not every kid has a positive outcome. Not every charter school performs like every other charter school. Some don't perform well, they don't live up to their charter, they close. Well, that doesn't happen in CPS, generally speaking. And do kids fall through the crack in CPS? I mean, the University of Chicago consortium on CPS research finds that 1 in 7 high school freshmen in a CPS school today will get a college degree by 25, 1 in 7. So I guess that would be, according to their standards, kids falling through the crack, wouldn't it?
That's right. And the whole idea of the charter model, right, is governance autonomy pursuant to a charter or a contract between an autonomous school and the families that they serve, right? Parents choose it, school held accountable. It's a model that works. It's unfortunate, though, that we're fighting these political battles right now about charters because on the west side and the south side, there are high school graduation rates that are much higher than they'd otherwise be because charter schools are there. If it weren't for charters on the west side, the overall attainment there and life chances would be much, much less.
Right, and so the other thing, I wonder if this is part of the opposition. I mean, I understand that part of the opposition is just we want to protect our centralized control over the system. We want our rank and file members to get certain salaries and benefit levels. This is about the adults in the system. I get that part. But I wonder if an underreported part of this is also concern about the internal logic of charter schools, which is that if I can see that charter schools are a positive innovation because they don't have to abide by all of the Politburo-like regulatory strictures of the neighborhood schools, then why should the neighborhood schools abide by those same centrally planned strictures? Why not model them after the charter schools and free up the system more generally? And then they really lose control.
Yeah, we've been saying this for years. In fact, in Springfield, we've said, look, the one critique about charters is why do you guys get special autonomy and flexibility? And we've always said, if it's good for charter public schools, make it applicable to all public schools. We've got no problem with that. In fact, we'd love to see waivers of regulations where appropriate and have that flexibility extend to all public schools.
Do you think people understand that the argument really is between people who want to centrally plan every school to the lowest common denominator, to the schools and the neighborhood schools in CPS that have not barely educated anybody in generations, versus those people who say, yeah, we have this regulatory relief so that we can plot our own course and provide different educational opportunities, and we would like to see that flexibility extended system-wide. So it's the competition model, effectively, within the public sector system versus the centrally planned model. And I don't know that people have fully internalized that choice.
No, but there's a big design choice you have to make. Are we about a school system or about a system of schools? We think the latter, right? And the whole idea is driven home by this point. When I ask somebody, do you think a central office somewhere will be able to manage schools in neighborhoods as diverse as Inglewood, Portage Park, South Shore, Chinatown, Rogers Park, and Humboldt Park equally well? Most people say no, it doesn't make sense. We've got to do some more distributed leadership, more autonomy locally, etc. Well, that's what charters do. They say if Lawndale has a problem with, say, third grade math attainment, let's put a high-performing STEM school in Lawndale to address that concern. If Rogers Park wants a performing arts academy because they've got a lot of students that desire that, let's put one there and attract them. And the thing about charters is no one's assigned to a charter school. Unlike a regular school where you have an attendance zone and people are assigned there, if the charter school can't attract students, it will not exist. So when people ask me, we want to stop charter growth, how do we do it? My answer is very simple. Here's the best way to stop charter growth. convince parents not to choose the school.
Or don't give them the option, I mean, which is what Rahm did by imposing a moratorium.
Yeah.
That's one way to stunt growth, is the central
Top-down
planners just say, you shall not have this choice. But I don't think it's received that way. And I wonder if this is a failure. Reform movements run into interference from the gatekeepers to the established order that like the system as it is because they benefit from it. And I wonder if parents, families in Chicago, and advocates of charter schools have not fully leveraged the power of their numbers to impose their will on politicians because of what we're seeing with charter schools kind of on the wane as a political force. I mean, is that fair? Do parents have? Is it one of these things where you have to say, look, I'm sorry for families that go to Urban Prep or Village Leadership Academy or the Noble Schools or wherever. Say, look, you have an additional burden, and it's disproportionate, and it's not fair. But it's just the way it is. If we're going to open up opportunities for other kids like your kids were fortunate enough to access, we need you to be a political force in addition to being engaged enough in your child's education that you sought out one of these higher performing charter schools.
That's right. And that work is underway. So we just had a press conference, for instance, with 50 charter parents in front of Will Gazzardi's office a few weeks ago to say to the representative, while you may have good schools or level 1+ and 1 in your district, your bill in Springfield, which would stop any charter growth in CPS and 87 other districts, would limit the ability of other places to have great quality schools. And so for a representative who says, I'm about local control, to propose a bill that would say to East St. Louis and North Chicago, you can't have a charter school, even if your local elected officials want to have one, smacks of hypocrisy. And our parents called that out.
Well, and I mean, I know that you're a bipartisan, post-partisan organization, but I mean, Will Gazzardi is one of the leading lights of what constitutes the progressive movement in Chicago and in the state. So how progressive is progressivism with respect to those self-identified progressives and their stance on competition and choice in K-12 education?
Well, there's nothing progressive about denying low-income families in black and brown communities access to better schools. That's regressive. And we talk about that all the time with elected officials through parents at our member schools. We take people to Springfield every other week during session. We have in-district visits. We keep working this to dramatize the fact that this isn't just a fight about macro politics. This is a fight about parents in challenged communities assigned to not performing schools that want a shot at life. And if a progressive can't get behind that, I call into question whether the progressive theory is what it needs to be.
And so is the elected local school council debate that rages in Chicago, is that a purposeful misdirection play? Whether the local school councils are appointed functionaries of the mayor or the established power structure, or whether they're elected and then those elections will be disproportionately influenced by the mayor and the unions. Is that a way to train people's focus away from the real issue of choice and make this about, if you elect your local school council, somehow we've decentralized power? It's just kind of a Potemkin village, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we have to think of the history on this. So when Secretary Bennett in the late 80s came to Chicago to visit the public school system, he famously said on the front page of the New York Times, Chicago is the worst school system in the country, right?
He said more than that. If you recall, he said this. He said the Ku Klux Klan could not design a system that is more destructive to minority children than the Chicago public school system. Did he say that? He said that.
I don't recall that.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's a strong statement. And you know what? The results, 30 years from Bill Bennett being the Secretary of Education, and frankly prior to that, boy, it's difficult to argue. It's difficult to argue in terms of the black and brown families, their opportunities and their children's educational attainment.
Yeah, the LSC model came out of dissatisfaction about a top-down CPS bureaucracy. So the idea was, let's distribute leadership ability in communities through these LSCs. In some respects, that's what charters do, but they do it through a nonprofit governing group that runs the school. We have found in our work that that's a better, more flexible model to adapt to local needs than the LSC has been. Now, there's a bill in Springfield right now that would impose the LSC governance structure on top of the charter nonprofit governance structure. We oppose that for a number of reasons. I don't think it's going to pass. But the evidence on charter school governance versus LSC governance, I think, is quite clear. Not just our data, CPS data, ISB data, some Stanford reports, all of that suggests that the nonprofit charter governance model has done great things in our city.
Well, and this is the thing that, I mean, I know the messaging is difficult and this gets a bit complicated because there's certain abstractions here, but this is the established order trying to prevent true reform with their faux reform to maintain their power and marginalize charter schools. Is that a fair description?
I don't think the LSC was designed to be faux reform. It was designed to be central decision-making, empowering neighborhoods. It hasn't worked out that way 22 years in. I do think, though, Dan, the movement the past 2 years to strangle charters through a variety of measures, right, and they look like a cap in the in-union contract, killing the charter commission of the state through legislation, closing buildings and then saying to charters, we're trying to sell these, but you can't even buy them.
Right.
It's worse than that. It's not just you can't access them and use them. You can't purchase them if you have a bona fide bidder with funds to purchase them. Now, that shows how crazy it is. We have these assets in communities that have been built and paid for by taxpayer dollars, sitting vacant, while a charter locates in a private building and CPS subsidizes the rent to that charter school for a private landlord. Aren't we all better off if we have access to a building built with taxpayer dollars, that has an auditorium, it has a gymnasium, things we don't usually have in the charter movement? I mean, that's a far better approach, but the politics of it make it very challenging.
Well, and I think the Tribune recently opined on this, and their numbers were 133 CPS schools, and there's about 660.
All right.
133 schools, less than half filled. Another 300 and odd schools that are underutilized. So you're talking about basically 60% of the building stock that is not at capacity. Some that's, you know, they're basically like ghost towns. There are schools like CVS on the south side that were built for 3,000 kids that have 300 in them. I mean, it's incredible. And they're saying that we're going to keep up appearances. We're going to continue to staff CVS like it still has 3,000 students. We're not going to allow anybody, any interloper like charter schools, to come in, pay fair market value to open up a school here. We put a moratorium on charter schools to open up at all in our buildings or somebody else's. I mean, you know, that starts to send a pretty clear message about their interest in providing the same choice that, say, Rahm Emanuel has for his kids, or Barack Obama has for his kids, or the wealthy and the politically connected have for their children writ large when it comes to choosing their K through 12 education.
Yeah, the point I've always made, Dan, is why is choice controversial for low-income communities of limited means? It's not controversial for folks who can move from town to town, who can choose a private school, who can afford parochial tuition. But for low-income families with limited access, then it becomes controversial? Because
I mean, here's one of the arguments made. You've heard this. Well, those people. Even if we gave them choice, those people, they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Well, we reject that, right? I think there's latent racism embedded
I don't think it's latent.
in this idea that somehow people can't choose the best school. The one point I've made when I've talked in Springfield to elected officials and elsewhere is on the capacity issue, CPS has lost about 50,000 students over the past 12 years. Right? They've added almost 100 new schools during that time. So any enterprise that loses market share, loses enrollment, and adds capacity will face what they're facing now. Oversupply of buildings, limited resources, etc. So we need to have a rational facilities plan inside CPS. We've been pushing this for years. But the challenge has been, we've had in the past 7 or 8 years, 6 CEOs, a lot of transition, a lot of changes, and trying to have a system that's coherent in light of all these political changes, very difficult.
Yeah, there's a certain consistency about the politics, because I know with mayors, whether it's Daley or Tiny Dancer, we go through this ridiculous pantomime where the mayor pretends that CPS is a separate taxing body, and I mean, I'm just the mayor, and it's not like I control the schools. Of course the mayor controls the schools. Of course the fifth floor controls the schools. It has from time immemorial. But we go through this ridiculous pantomime because the mayor, whether it's Daley or Rahm, doesn't want to accept responsibility for what's happening on their watch, and they want to kind of paper over Renaissance 2010 under Daley and Rahm closing 15 schools out of the gate and then completely capitulating to the unions. So we go through this whole thing, and the reality is there is continuity of political leadership because the CPS superintendent, when they don't go to prison, they just serve as a toady for the mayor. And the mayor's disposition, all of Chicago mayors since we've been alive, has been Politburo style central planning for K through 12 education in Chicago.
Yeah, the difference, though,
I mean,
is that back in 2003,
okay,
when Mayor Daley and Arnie Duncan launched Renaissance 2010, there was a very clear vision of what that was designed to do. It was designed to open up 100 brand new autonomous schools by 2010, so in 7 years. And while they added new capacity high performers of all types of schools, charters, contract, district run, you would also close or replace low-performing, historically failing schools. So the idea was build great new ones, replace the bad ones. Over time, you get this virtuous cycle. What's happened since then?
what happened between 2003 and 2010? That didn't materialize.
We had substantial new school growth. We had closures, not at the pace that would replace one-to-one, but we had a plan and a vision, right? That was the point. We had a mission. We had the community behind it, automatic support, politicians behind it. Now what we've got basically is a fiscal crisis taking up all the oxygen, a political fight between the CTU and the mayor, a Springfield fight, complicating matters downstream of that,
right,
and charters left to kind of fend for themselves with no plan about what the goals are. And we've been trying to push goals around building access and replicate high performance, et cetera, but everything else crowds that out, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, how sympathetic are you to Forrest Claypool taking his tin can and rattling it down the rail in Springfield with respect to more money for CPS? CPS spends $15.2 per pupil per year, which is 20% higher than the state average. They get a more than representative share of poverty grants. And yet they continue to want a blank check, want to be bailed out by the state and by Illinois taxpayers who don't live in Chicago, in addition to those that do, because they don't want to deal with the structural infirmities of a system that is currently junk rated in the bond market.
So I'm a strong believer that our system of funding public schools in the state broadly is terribly broken. It's been broken for 25 years. It's gotten more extreme in terms of inequity. To fix it, though, you've got to address both the special CPS block grant and the state paying for pensions everywhere except for CPS. There's a package deal there, but until we see some leadership and a vision, it's hard to see how this happens, right? I'll give you one illustration. Many other states, Dan, have fairly substantial state equalization grants that take low wealth districts and equalize their wealth and make sure they're not spending too little. Illinois does very little of that. And the consequence...
How does CPS get to 15.2?
So the consequence is that in Illinois, if you look at the best funded districts and the least funded districts, the ratio is about 4-to-1. About 24,000 at the top, 6,000 at the bottom. In most states, it's more like 2-to-1 because they equalize the bottom distribution of schools. We do very little of that and have micro districts too that are kind of hyper, that kind of really charge the local taxpayers with paying all the dollars towards these schools.
Right.
And so wealthy districts get well-funded schools, poor districts, poor schools. CPS is actually above the state average on what they spend per pupil. It's not well known.
And it's a majority of the funding comes from the state, not local taxpayers like most of the suburban districts. So I mean, I understand what you're saying writ large statewide, but with respect to CPS and their claim on other people's money, it's not a particularly strong claim.
Yeah, I don't see it as other people's money. What I see it as is a state system where deals have been cut historically, those things have built up over time. CPS avoided pension payments for 10 years in a row, then got pension holidays, and has caused the fiscal problem right now. I mean, if we had...
With the backing of the teachers union to skip those payments. So they conspired on this, and then they want to cry, hey, hey, hey.
Now consider this. If the $712 million CPS have to spend at the end of this year into the pension system, did not have to be spent on the pension system, we would have no fiscal challenges in CPS to speak of, even despite the oversupply of buildings, even despite these problems. So you've got to have a solution that fixes that while we're fixing the larger funding problem.
Well, right, but doesn't there have to be accountability mechanisms in the system so that you can't conspire to defraud the pension system for 15 years and then come to Illinois and say, hey, if you don't fund, if you don't backfill this conspiracy to defraud that we cooked up and enacted over 15 years, then you don't like children.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the argument. And I'll tell you, in 2010, I was in the committee hearing where CPS testified for a 3-year pension holiday. I remember distinctly the chair of the commission asking this question. He said, all right, CPS, if we grant you this today, what assurance do we have that 3 years from now, you won't be back here asking for another 3-year holiday? And the testimony was, we can assure you that will not happen, we can promise you it won't happen, et cetera, right? It happens. 3 years later, guess what? Same arguments made, we want to have the pension holiday, et cetera. So I agree. You can't prioritize and privilege people who've caused the problem they complain of now, but at the same time, going back 20, 30 years, we've got a structural problem in Illinois that we've got to fix, and if we don't fix it, it just gets worse and worse, and the impact falls most harshly on the lowest income communities.
No question about it. No question about it. I mean, I talk about property taxes a lot, since property taxes is the primary funder of K through 12 in this state. And the highest property tax rate as a percentage of home value in Cook County, where do you think it is?
Where?
Yeah, what community? Follow your logic.
I would say a low-income southwest side suburb.
You're very close. You're in the right region. Fort Heights. 100% African American, one of the poorest communities, not just in Illinois, in the country. Their effective property tax rate as a percentage of home value in Fort Heights is 10.5%. That is usurious. That is loan shark. And
their assessed valuation is so low. Well, 10% generates what?
Well, it generates nothing. But the point is you're eliminating the possibility of home ownership, or you're telling those families that are trying to climb up
the tax you can't.
That you can't. You're going to pay for your home every 4 years, every 5 years, just in property taxes. That is the national average, 0.9%. So 10, 11x is what Fort Heights is paying. In Illinois, as a general rule, we're paying 3x and 4x because of the system of how we finance schools, which I agree with you is the wrong way to do it. And I'm someone who believes in all the component parts of the Illinois Constitution. So constitutionally balanced budget, which includes pension liabilities on a real-time basis, financing them. But also the state being the majority funder, the primary funder, which is in the Constitution, the primary funder of K through 12 education. And so the way that you do that is to starve the beast at the local level, is to cap property taxes as a percentage of home value and tell all of the noblemen and magistrates in Springfield, this is what the Constitution says, you're at 25% now, get to 51%. And that would require prioritization of state spending on K through 12 education. It would also require completely rethinking and restructuring everything state government does, because you couldn't get to that number without it. Yeah. I mean, is that a fair vision? I don't know. When you talk about how the state funds education, I mean, what's your vision for it?
Yeah, and I was a lawyer in private practice for a number of years doing school finance litigation. So I've looked at funding formulas in various states. I like heavy equalization for low wealth districts. I like the state doing the majority share of the funding. I like keeping local property taxes low, giving local citizens a referendum ability to override that if they want to, but that's their choice, right? Let them decide to tax themselves more.
Yes.
The challenge has always been, if a system allows you to tax yourself locally to raise money, but some of that money winds up going to the state coffers for distribution elsewhere, what's the incentive for a district to tax themselves? So you got to build a system that allows them to retain a good portion of that. But I like the metes and bounds of what you described, because right now what we've got is weak state funding, heavy local property taxes. When someone proposes the idea, which I think makes sense, of let local districts carry their own weight on pensions, so they're not giving sweeteners at the end of the deal
Yeah,
and
that's
then
right.
offshoring the costs.
Right.
Everyone yells about, oh, property tax increase. Well, if you fix the system, you wouldn't have that at all, right?
Right.
It's
It forces fiduciary responsibility at the local level for those school board members. You can't just sign blank checks when you go to contract negotiation.
Yeah.
You know, like the way Chicago does. But here's something else on that score with respect to kind of rethinking how we're doing this. When it comes to K through 12 funding, other accountability mechanisms that bring in charter schools and maybe bring in some lessons learned from charter schools that could be applied system-wide.
Yeah, I like it. You might recall that there was a push inside CPS years ago to put every school on a 5-year performance contract. That's what charters do.
Right.
So a charter is actually a 5-year performance document that says to the school, you operate for 5 years under this license, and if you perform at this level, and you can prove it, you get renewed. If you don't, you close. And we've closed a dozen charter schools in the past 7 years based on that accountability mechanism. I think that's a mechanism that's worked for all schools. And it need not be closure for all of them, but maybe there's some kind of increasing intervention, some kind of new approach to make sure the school has real accountability. Because right now, a school can be there for years and years and years and years and nothing meaningful happens. And at the federal level, with ESSA replacing NCLB, they're pushing all the decision making down to state departments of education, and the record there on accountability has been abysmal.
Well, sure, it's just
States
another centrally planned
don't really
gambit.
care about doing that, and when they've tried to, it hasn't worked.
So, with respect to charter schools, you know, one of the things I think that maybe has blunted the ascendancy of the charter school reform movement in Chicago, high-profile scandals.
Yeah.
So, the UNO charter schools in particular. Talk about corruption within the charter schools. I mean, again, this just in, we've had some corruption in CPS too. Barbara Bird Bennett sitting in federal prison, oh, by the way. But the corruption at UNO and, that really, I think, cast a bit of a cloud over charter schools where people started to look and say, well, they've got the same problems as CPS, so what are we doing?
Yeah, it's a nice point. It's a fair point, and it's something we as a movement need to take care of. And we've been clear with our membership when it comes to accountability and fiscal stewardship, since we receive public dollars, that we have open meetings requirements, audit requirements. So we're working on making sure that happens. At the same time, I get a bit tired of every time there's an individual school, charter school somewhere in Ohio, and there's a story about it, it winds up in Springfield as a cautionary tale about Illinois. And I have to say, you do realize with thousands of schools around the country, there's Title I embezzlement that happens. And I don't say because that happens in a school in Ohio, how dare the district schools here do that, right? So it's a little bit of selective categorizing of charters on this. Having said that, I want to be clear, we've got an issue with it. We're working on it through our membership, and I think you won't see much of that in the future.
So there's a self-policing, and this is
Definitely.
an important part of the conversation internally because
Definitely.
self-policing is something that doesn't happen almost in any enterprise, political or governmental in this state. So, I mean...
And we have a real interest in making sure we're good fiscal stewards,
Right.
We're transparent, we serve students openly, we report out on results, which we do. We've even supported closing low-performing charters affirmatively, not in response to CPS pushing, but saying, look, it's been 5 years, you said you do X, you haven't done that, it's time for you to either give up the charter to someone else or close, and no other district public school has done that in Chicago.
And unlike CPS, you're put to a market test. The market test is you've got a 15,000 person waiting list. Yep. What about charter schools thinking outside Chicago, because it's not just a Chicago issue, and there are schools in the suburbs and downstate, school districts, that frankly aren't getting the job done either and could use a little bit of innovation that competition brings. Talk about the suburban experience contrasted from the city experience.
Sure. So we've got charter schools in places as diverse as Rockford, Peoria, Springfield, Decatur, East St. Louis, Effingham, but it's still very ad hoc and very kind of singular outside of Chicago. The suburbs have been a much tougher nut to crack. We've got charter schools in Southland College Prep, which is in Rickton Park in the southern suburbs. Mm-hmm. We've got 2 in North Chicago, 1 in Waukegan. I'm very proud to announce that a few weeks ago, Elgin approved their first charter school ever that'll open up in fall of 18. And we've been working with a lot of communities to identify places where there aren't good schools, where there isn't much ability of the constituency to afford private school or moving, and trying to work with those communities on bringing a charter model there. We've been met with some real interest among community groups and parents and some religious officials. And we've met, frankly, with some opposition from the political class in those places about how we do it, when we do it, what the timing is. But we're bullish that a lot of these communities will see the power of chartering, embrace it, and will open up schools in the coming years.
And so, just going back to Chicago and the political element of this, because you can't get away from it, because getting a charter is a political process. One of the things that strikes me, so I participated in the little poker tournament fundraiser Tim King does for Urban Prep every year, and I mean, what Tim King's done at Urban Prep is unbelievable. It's incredible. He's done an amazing job, and so have other charter schools. But it's very difficult when I talk to Tim. It's very difficult for him to break bad on CPS, to break bad on what I term, you don't have to term it, but I term it, the ruling class in this city, the ruling class in this state. And I just wonder if, as a president of the trade association, if you will, for charter schools, if you'd like to see more political leadership from the successful operators to say, hey, over here, look at me, look at Tim King and Urban Prep. There shouldn't be 3 schools under Tim King's leadership. There should be 300. It's like talking about Peyton Prep. Peyton Prep's great, but instead of 400 seats, they need 400,000 seats. That's the problem. But Tim is very reticent to break bad on the party with which he affiliates and the people that are in office affiliated with that party. And others are similar. Nikisha Hobbs at Village Leadership Academy, the same thing. We could have a great conversation on school choice. We get beyond school choice, and it's right back to the orthodoxy of the political ruling class in this state. Now, I'm a conservative Republican. I don't think that's a big secret. But do I have a point to say, hey, you don't have to adopt Prof's rhetoric or any Republican's rhetoric. You don't have to make it a partisan issue, but you do need to say, in your own interests of educating young black men the way that Tim King does, hey, you guys are preventing me from doing more than I'm doing, and I'm better at this than anybody. And so give me more, and I will do more. But I want everybody to know that you people in office are the ones preventing me from doing more for more. What about that?
Yeah, I think there's a real awakening among the charter school leadership in the city about the need for direct political advocacy work on a number of fronts. Tim King's a great example of a guy who had an idea and has built a remarkable network of schools and has done things for young African American men that no one else has done. We should be celebrating that. I know personally that our best networks, Noble, Urban Prep, etc., are being recruited to go elsewhere in the country heavily because they're rolling out the red carpet for them. I want Chicago to be the place that does that, and we're competitive to keep and retain and attract the best operators in the country. We're not there right now. We've got to fix that. And that means we've got to step out of our comfort zone a bit and talk about what's impeding growth, and the answer to that is mainly politics. The only thing I'd say about the bipartisan nature of this is that it doesn't make it easy, Dan, when we've got Republican charter supporters who don't support a lot of the other things that the charter community stands for in terms of access to health care, access to equal justice under the law, things like that. So we've had a lot of discussions with our Republican allies about this particular point.
Okay.
And we're trying to say, look, we need you to be vocal on some things, but it's not helpful if you're vocal on this thing. And so it's a very delicate balance as a coalition, which we're trying to build.
Well, tell me. I mean, I've done enough lecturing. You lecture me. You tell me what conservative Republicans like me should be doing to advance the movement.
Sure. So we have a large number of undocumented students in charter schools in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the rhetoric about getting rid of DACA, punishing dreamers, we've got to have this or that, is tone deaf to a movement that is trying to give opportunity to families. We've got 60,000 students in Chicago. My guess is 10 to 12,000 of those students are undocumented. And so our movement is very much defensive about any repealing of Obama's DACA order, etc. That's just one illustration of issues I've seen pop up all across the spectrum that have the ability to kind of divide the movement. And we have really robust debates about this within the charter movement that aren't for public consumption, about where we stand, how we triangulate this, who our allies are. But at the end of the day, we're trying to build a movement that stands for opportunity. And we can't do that while we're denying families access to some of the great things the country can provide.
When you, it's a fair point. Okay, yeah. When you see at the federal level or at the state level, people that were once great proponents of school choice, writ large, including opportunity scholarships or even just charters, and then they get elected to office and they flip. I mean, one of the most notorious examples is Cory Booker, who was honored by the American Federation for Children, right? And he gave a speech at their banquet about, yay, Betsy DeVos. Then he testified against Betsy DeVos in her confirmation hearing for Education Secretary. Explain to people, I'm just using that as an example, explain to people what happens in education reform where somebody can go from a champion of rethinking how we're doing K through 12 education in the 21st century as an outsider, and when they get inside, they get co-opted, and then they become an opponent of the very things they were advocating just a few moments ago before they won office.
Yeah, I think the difference between education reform as an issue and other single issues that animate voters, whether it's abortion rights, gun control, etc., is that very few education reform supporters are single issue supporters. They have a multiplicity of issues they deal with. And when we have someone like President Trump talking about how he likes charters, but doesn't know what a charter is really, when you kind of dig deeper, doesn't have much of a record at all of education generally. And when he proposes a budget that zeroes out Title II funding and does other things on Pell Grants that hurt low-income communities, like, how does the charter movement deal with that? Some of the movement says, well, we've got to work with the new administration and see what happens. Others say that's not what we're about. And when I see politicians flip-flop, I just say, what do we need to do as a movement to convince them and give them cover to do what's right? Because they know, I mean, Cory Booker knows that what happened in Newark under his watch would not have been possible without North Star Academy, KIPP, and other charter schools. He knows in his bones. So the question for us is, if he flips, he is seeing a calculation politically that makes it more expedient to join the other side. Why haven't we done our work well enough to show him, hey, we can be a political force and give you support in the way you need it in light of what you've done in the past?
And just sticking on this topic to take it on a tangent, but still in the same area, school choice writ large, opportunity scholarships, which I am a strong proponent of. What Mitch Daniels and to a lesser extent Mike Pence, because it was already moving by the time Pence became governor of Indiana, what he did with all of the competition in K through 12 proponents in Indiana was to say, hey, charter school people and Friedman Foundation and Opportunity Scholarship people, we're all going to do this together, and we're all going to support each other's initiatives, because if we don't do this together, nobody gets anything. It kind of instituted that kind of discipline, which is why Daniels, in my opinion, was such a great governor of Indiana, because he provided the executive leadership to say, you want charter schools, so do I. You want opportunity scholarships, so do I. We're going to do this together, or, it's kind of the hang together, or we're going to hang separately. And Indiana now, frankly, stunningly, it's almost difficult to say, is a bit of a model nationally in education reform, where they've come from over the last 20 years, both in terms of extending opportunity scholarships to middle-income families as well as the charter school movement there. Is that the right approach for, regardless of party affiliation, to bring all of the proponents of choice together and deal with some of the ancillary issues that make people uncomfortable with one another, but also to say, on this core issue where everybody's trying to get their particular iteration of choice advanced, it's got to be done collectively. That's the best way to do it.
I think so, but we shouldn't be blind to the fact that sometimes the educational choice community feels like a circular firing squad.
Yeah.
They kind of get around, we have different issues. The biggest fault line is between public school choice and non-public school choice, whether it's vouchers, opportunity scholarships, etc. I've worked in this field long enough to know and have a lot of colleagues, deep respect for people that work all across that spectrum. And we don't do a good enough job as a movement designing that. I think part of Indiana or Louisiana or New York's success has been when there's a clear executive vision out of a Mayor Bloomberg or out of a governor of Indiana, and they come together and say, here's the vision, how can you all slot in the appropriate way? We don't have a lot of that here in Illinois. I mean, we just don't, we're facing such a pressing fiscal problem that there's no coalescing around an education reform agenda or a choice agenda, or for that matter, a funding agenda, right? We're just all kind of warring in our different tribes, and it's yielding not a lot.
Yeah, the opportunities and the challenges. He's Andrew Broy. He's the president of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Dan, good to be with you.
Great talk.